It began like every other Meghan Markle project, with fanfare, flashing lights, curated Instagram teasers, and an avalanche of press releases dripping with buzzwords: authentic, empowering, inclusive. The world had seen Meghan in many roles: actress, duchess, podcaster, philanthropist. But this time, she was stepping into an entirely different realm, one of soft-focus kitchen shots, heartwarming anecdotes, and elegantly plated entrees. This was With Love, Meghan, the cooking show that was supposed to rebrand Meghan Markle yet again, not as royalty, not as a media mogul, but as something warmer, more relatable, more human. But it didn't go that way. The world only saw the polished trailers, the edited teaser clips showing Meghan gliding through a sun-drenched kitchen, laughing gently as she stirred something organic in a copper pot. But inside Netflix headquarters, something else was brewing. Something darker, more unsettling, and far more real than anyone had anticipated. What they saw behind the scenes wasn't a duchess reborn, but a woman unraveling. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Weeks before the premiere, the Netflix executive board found itself gathered in a private screening room, their faces lit by the flickering images of raw, uncut footage from the show. The air was thick. No one spoke. And then came the scene, unfiltered, unpolished, damning. Meghan Markle barking orders at producers, snapping at assistants, mocking a crew member's accent, rolling her eyes at a culinary consultant, and demanding a complete reset because the camera angle didn't flatter her essence. One executive reportedly whispered, "This isn't a cooking show. This is a meltdown captured on film." By the time the lights came up, Netflix's leadership wasn't debating whether there was a problem. The debate was over what to do about it. What happens when the face of your multi-million-dollar investment reveals a side that can't be edited out? What do you do when your golden brand ambassador is caught tearing through a set like a queen without a crown? This wasn't just a PR crisis. This was an identity crisis. Because for years, Meghan Markle's public persona had been carefully guarded, sometimes by the palace, sometimes by PR firms, and later, by her own team of media handlers. She was the underdog turned royal, the misunderstood outsider, the woman who challenged the monarchy and walked away with her own voice. But what Netflix now had in its possession told a very different story, one that seemed to validate what former royal staffers had hinted at, what gossip columns had whispered, and what some insiders had feared all along. This new footage wasn't meant for public consumption. It was never supposed to see the light of day, but it did, and the decision to release it, or at least leak enough to cause a digital landslide, did not come lightly. For Netflix CEO Ted Sarandos, it was a gamble, one that could ignite controversy, sever relationships, and unleash legal fury from a duchess known for protecting her image like a fortress. But maybe that was the point. Maybe Sarandos had simply had enough. Enough of the lawsuits. Enough of the tension. Enough of being dragged into every scandal involving the Sussex brand. And maybe, just maybe, he knew that if he didn't reveal the truth first, someone else eventually would. The question now wasn't about damage control. The question was, who would survive the fallout? As the footage leaked, strategically, quietly, and then virally, it began to tell a very different narrative than the one Meghan had hoped to project. Staff began to speak out, one by one, each emboldened by the undeniable evidence. One former production assistant who worked on the show described her experience bluntly. "You were either invisible or an obstacle. That was the only way she saw you." Another culinary consultant, a renowned chef flown in to provide authenticity and cultural depth, recalled being corrected so aggressively in front of the entire crew that he walked off set. "She wanted the food to tell her story," he said, "but only the parts that made her look like a saint." What had begun as a brand rehabilitation project quickly spiraled into a behind-the-scenes disaster. Meghan's carefully curated voiceovers, peppered with poetic musings about her childhood and reflections on her mother's kitchen, were now being contrasted with footage of her ridiculing a lighting crew for setting up too many fluorescent tones. The image was breaking, fracturing into pieces too sharp to hold on to. For those who had always believed in her, who defended her against royal smears, tabloid headlines, and internet trolls, this was a painful moment. For others, it was vindication. But why did this show, of all projects, spark such a dramatic unraveling? Some say it was pressure. Meghan had everything riding on, with Love, Meghan. It was her first solo venture post-Archetypes, after her Spotify deal was quietly ended. Her reputation in Hollywood had grown strained, and whispers in Beverly Hills lunch clubs questioned whether her brand still had pull. This show was supposed to remind everyone that Meghan wasn't just a duchess in exile. She was a star, a woman of taste, a force. But inside the studio, the energy was different. Meghan, once praised for her poise, became known among the crew for her perfectionism bordering on tyranny. The smallest things became points of tension: a garnish placed slightly off-center, a camera angle revealing too much jawline, a guest chef mispronouncing quinoa. Days stretched into 12-hour marathons of retakes, delays, and walkouts. One intern claimed they were told to never make direct eye contact unless spoken to. Another said they were reprimanded for handing Meghan the wrong towel. When asked about the culture on set, one former crew member paused, looked away, and said, "You didn't speak. You obeyed. And if you didn't, you disappeared." It wasn't just staff who were affected. Reports began to emerge of Harry visiting the set, visibly anxious, trying to smooth things over, attempting to mediate between his wife and the growing number of disgruntled employees. But according to sources, his efforts only made things worse. Meghan allegedly saw his presence as undermining her authority. One crew member overheard her saying, "This isn't your mother's palace, Harry. Let me run this how I need to." The cracks were widening. And then came the day Netflix couldn't ignore. Multiple complaints filed within a single week. A senior producer resigning mid-shoot. A letter from a guest chef refusing to appear unless respect for the culinary team was ensured. These were no longer growing pains. These were red flags waving in the face of a platform known for turning chaos into content. But even Netflix has a line, and Meghan Markle had just crossed it. That's when the footage review began. Internally, Netflix pulled together what they had: unedited dailies, backup recordings, audio logs. What they found was worse than anticipated. And as the scenes played out in real time for the executives, the myth of Meghan Markle began to shift. This wasn't just a tantrum. It was a pattern. Suddenly, stories from former palace aides made more sense. Complaints that had once been written off as jealousy or institutional racism were being seen through a different lens. The allegations of bullying. The ex-staffers describing a toxic work environment. The assistant who quit just 10 days after Meghan arrived at Kensington Palace. All of it now looked eerily familiar. Still, this wasn't the royal family. This was Netflix. This was business. And in business, image is currency. By the time the decision to leak selected footage was made, Netflix's top brass had already begun preparing for war. Legal teams reviewed contracts, exit clauses were analyzed, and contingency PR strategies drafted. Meghan, it turned out, was already planning her own counterstrike. Her team issued vague warnings to the media, calling upcoming reports deeply misleading and rooted in misogyny. But the footage didn't lie. The public had eyes now. And what they saw was not a woman being wronged, but a woman wielding power with entitlement, impatience, and a stunning disregard for the people behind the camera. What does it mean when the person you've been cheering for turns out to be the villain of their own story? That's the question that began trending online. And it wasn't going away. Not when clips were being dissected frame by frame on TikTok. Not when headlines began piling up. Not when public opinion, once Meghan's strongest ally, began to shift like sand beneath her feet. This was not just a PR nightmare. This was a reckoning, and it had only just begun. When the news first broke that Netflix had secured an exclusive production deal with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the entertainment world practically stopped in its tracks. Headlines screamed with excitement. Royals enter Hollywood. Meghan and Harry sign $100 million deal with Netflix. The Sussexes take control of their narrative. It felt historic, almost revolutionary. A former senior royal couple, known worldwide, stepping into the streaming arena, bypassing traditional institutions and forging their own path. To many, it symbolized freedom. To Netflix, it was pure gold, or so it seemed. Ted Sarandos, co-CEO of Netflix, was among the earliest and most enthusiastic champions of the Sussex brand. He saw the potential immediately. A global fan base, a never-ending supply of curiosity around their lives, and the promise of royal drama laced with modern storytelling. What more could a streaming giant ask for? Meghan Markle wasn't just a former actress. She was a cultural icon, an American who had infiltrated the British monarchy and emerged, depending on whom you asked, as either a victim or a victor. That kind of narrative currency was rare, and Netflix believed they had struck it rich. The pitch had been simple. Meghan and Harry would create content that mattered, content that uplifted, informed, and inspired. Documentaries, scripted series, docuseries, children's programming, and yes, eventually lifestyle and cooking shows. Their production company, Archwell Productions, was meant to serve as the creative vehicle through which their values could reach millions. But beneath the surface of the press-friendly language was a deal laced with unspoken expectations and corporate pressure. Netflix wasn't a charity. It was a business with shareholders, metrics, and a fierce competition for dominance in the streaming war. The Sussexes weren't hired to be activists. They were hired to deliver results. Initially, the excitement seemed warranted. Their first project, Harry and Meghan, a 6-part docuseries, brought in big numbers. The opening weekend saw millions of views. Netflix's PR department called it one of our most successful documentary launches ever. But internally, reactions were more mixed. Some executives felt the series leaned too heavily into royal grievance, with limited global appeal beyond scandal enthusiasts. The storytelling was deemed one note, intimate but repetitive, emotional but lacking true depth. And most importantly, it did not result in the long-term subscriber surge Netflix had quietly hoped for. Behind closed doors, murmurs began. Had Netflix invested too heavily in personalities rather than proven content creators? Could Meghan and Harry pivot from subjects to storytellers? When Archwell began pitching follow-up projects, the tone shifted. Netflix wanted more universal stories, content that appealed not just to royal watchers, but to broader, global audiences. Meghan, however, had her own vision, and she was adamant about it. That vision included a cooking show. It seemed harmless at first, even charming. With Love, Meghan was pitched as a lifestyle meets culinary series that would blend storytelling, culture, and recipes into a warm, inviting format. Meghan herself would be front and center, inviting guests from diverse backgrounds, sharing food from her childhood, and reflecting on the power of meals to unite people across differences. On paper, it read like a winner. The development phase started smoothly. Netflix approved a modest budget. Meghan's team began securing chefs, set designers, and cultural consultants. But even in pre-production, the signs were there. Meghan was heavily involved, far more than expected. From the shade of tiles in the kitchen set to the origin of the copper pots, she wanted input on everything. What some would call hands-on soon became overbearing. One production designer claimed Meghan rejected a kitchen layout 7 times in a week because it didn't feel like her grandmother's, but also needed to look aspirational. Tensions rose when she demanded full creative control over the series, including final cut approval, a request Netflix initially resisted. While talent having input was normal, complete control was rare. But Meghan was insistent. She believed that her public image was still fragile, still misrepresented by media narratives, and that this show would be a defining moment. She couldn't afford a single frame that wasn't aligned with her values. After lengthy negotiations, a compromise was reached. Meghan would receive substantial creative input, and Netflix would have oversight to ensure content viability. Still, insiders say the decision left a bitter taste for several executives who felt they had handed too much power to someone with little experience behind the camera. From that point on, the relationship between Meghan's team and Netflix's production department grew strained. Meetings ran over time. Notes from Netflix were reportedly ignored or argued against. When the company requested a broader appeal for international audiences, Meghan allegedly replied, "This show is about authenticity. My story, my voice. If that's not global enough, then maybe we aren't aligned." It was a chilling moment. One Netflix director who witnessed the exchange said the room fell silent. Not because of the tone, but because of the realization Meghan Markle wasn't just the star of this show. She was the show. Every frame, every bite, every word. It had to reflect her image, her journey, her version of truth. And any deviation from that was seen as betrayal. As filming began, The stakes couldn't have been higher. The kitchen set was constructed on a soundstage that cost over $300,000. Celebrity chefs were flown in. Cultural experts were hired to ensure representation. Yet from the first shoot day, friction became the norm. Meghan reportedly arrived 2 hours late, citing last-minute script changes. Upon seeing the set, she demanded immediate alterations to the backsplash tiles. When a lighting rig cast a shadow on her cheekbone, production was paused for nearly an hour. Crew members were expected to adhere to an unspoken code. Don't make eye contact, don't interrupt, don't question her notes. A former assistant producer summed it up this way: "It was less of a cooking show and more of a coronation." The deeper issue wasn't just about control, it was about tone. Meghan's on-camera persona was soft, thoughtful, gently reflective. But the moment the cameras stopped rolling, that facade reportedly dropped. Staff described a stark contrast between her public warmth and private rigidity. If a segment didn't go her way, she'd blame the chef. If dialogue felt forced, she'd blame the writer. If the kitchen was too cold, she'd blame production. And slowly, morale began to crack. By the third week, 3 staff members had quit. One chef canceled their segment without explanation. Another requested not to be featured in the final edit, citing creative differences. Yet, through all this, Netflix kept filming. And why wouldn't they? They had already invested millions. The footage, no matter how chaotic behind the scenes, could still be edited into something palatable. Or so they thought. What they didn't account for was the tipping point. A breaking moment that would turn a difficult production into a corporate liability. And that moment was coming fast. But the signs were there, buried in emails, whispered in hallways, leaked via anonymous tip lines. The question wasn't if the deal would collapse, it was when. Because in Hollywood, image is everything. But when that image begins to crack under pressure, the fallout isn't artistic. It's nuclear. The set of With Love, Meghan was supposed to be a haven of warmth and nostalgia, a place where stories would be exchanged over simmering pots and family recipes would connect generations. But as the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere shifted from inviting to unbearable. Cameras captured laughter and connection, but just beyond the lens, there was tension so thick it could be sliced with a knife. The very project that was meant to redefine Meghan Markle's public image began to morph into something else entirely, a battleground for control. Meghan envisioned the show as her personal love letter to food and heritage. But for the crew, it became something far different, a pressure cooker where every decision had to pass through a single person's approval, hers. While other celebrity-driven shows functioned through a collaborative model, with executive producers, directors, culinary experts, and stylists working in harmony, Meghan's production became a one-woman operation in spirit, if not in title. Every aspect of the show, down to the font used in the opening title sequence, had to be approved by Meghan herself. Scripts were revised repeatedly, often the night before shoots. Wardrobe choices for guests had to be sent to her for sign-off, even though some of them were industry veterans or culinary stars in their own right. And while the premise promised an inclusive celebration of culinary cultures, insiders said it felt more like a stylized biopic masquerading as a cooking show. The show's title, With Love, Meghan, was meant to evoke a personal touch, like a handwritten letter or a thoughtful dish prepared for someone special. But as the production dragged on, the phrase began to take on a new meaning among the crew. A tongue-in-cheek warning. With love came to imply with rules, and with Meghan meant, be prepared. It was the little things that began to accumulate. One crew member recalled a moment when Meghan demanded that all fresh produce used in the show be flown in from specific organic farms in California, even though they were shooting in New York. The costs skyrocketed, and when the farm's shipment arrived late due to a storm, Meghan allegedly berated the segment producer for not respecting the vision. Then came the scripting drama. Though marketed as an unscripted, organic experience, Meghan insisted that every interaction be pre-discussed. She would request detailed outlines for each guest, including their talking points, emotional beats, and culinary stories. She reportedly told one writer, "This show isn't about their recipes. It's about how their story reflects my story." When guests deviated from the expected arc, even slightly, she would cut the take. One chef who shared a personal memory of cooking with their grandmother was told to tighten the narrative, and link it more clearly to modern themes. Another guest, a best-selling author and food historian, was pulled aside after a take and advised to be more inspired, less academic. Even the food wasn't safe. Despite hiring world-class food stylists, Meghan frequently overrode their decisions. Plates were redesigned mid-shoot. Color palettes were shifted. One dish, a traditional stew passed down through 3 generations of a guest's family, was deemed visually heavy and replaced with a lighter, more photogenic alternative. The guest, embarrassed and frustrated, left the set early and refused to return for the planned interview segment. For those behind the camera, the workdays grew exhausting. Schedules were fluid. What was meant to be a 5-hour shoot often became a 12-hour marathon. On more than one occasion, shooting halted for over an hour while Meghan reviewed lighting angles and adjusted wardrobe accessories. Hair and makeup teams were frequently summoned back for touch-ups between takes, not because of necessity, but because Meghan didn't feel aligned with the image on screen. At first, the Netflix team tried to accommodate. After all, they had signed a deal with a global figure who brought in headlines and subscribers. But as the delays piled up and the crew's complaints began to increase, executives started paying closer attention. Daily reports from the set painted a picture that clashed violently with the cheerful, community-centered brand the show was meant to uphold. To make matters more complex, Meghan's inner circle began treating the production as an extension of her personal platform. Requests for media tie-ins, promotional photo shoots, and cross-brand collaborations were pushed aggressively. Her team began pitching with Love, Meghan merchandise, cookbooks, scented candles, aprons with inspirational quotes, all before a single episode had been completed. Netflix, already under strain from the production delays, was blindsided. They hadn't even seen the first rough cut, and the marketing machine was being pushed full steam ahead. The power dynamic tilted even further when Meghan started bringing in her own editors to sit with the post-production team. This was almost unheard of for a non-director talent. These editors were tasked with protecting her image at all costs. Scenes that didn't capture her energy were flagged for removal. Any guest who outshone her during a segment was edited down. One production source recalled, "We were cutting a show for one audience, her. The viewers were an afterthought." Despite mounting concerns, no one felt empowered to confront her directly. Meghan wasn't just another producer. She was a public figure with global recognition and a track record of turning criticism into narrative ammunition. Disagreeing with her on set meant risking professional relationships and possibly public backlash. Internally, some began referring to her as the Executive Duchess, a not-so-subtle nod to her royal past and controlling present. Meanwhile, morale on set hit rock bottom. Several crew members requested reassignment to other Netflix projects. One key member of the culinary team quit midway through the season, citing philosophical differences with the production approach. The showrunner, initially excited to be working with such a high-profile personality, eventually resigned altogether, sending an email to Netflix executives stating, "This is no longer a creative environment. It's a royal court." Still, Netflix pushed forward. They had too much invested to pull the plug, and despite all the chaos behind the scenes, early teasers of the show were performing well with test audiences. The concept still had legs. If they could just make it through production, perhaps the show could be salvaged. But deep inside the edit bay, as the raw footage was compiled, another truth emerged, one that even the most forgiving executive couldn't ignore. The disparity between Meghan's on-camera charm and off-camera demeanor wasn't just noticeable, it was jarring. Camera mics accidentally left running picked up stern commands, snide remarks, and complaints about lighting, noise, and even the smell of certain ingredients. Footage surfaced of Meghan stopping an entire shoot because the sound of onions sizzling in a pan was too aggressive. Her tone in these moments wasn't angry, it was imperial. And for Netflix, that spelled trouble. Because while audiences might accept high standards and even diva behavior from celebrity chefs or actors, with Love, Meghan wasn't selling a performance. It was selling sincerity. A Duchess-turned everywoman, sharing recipes from her soul. The premise hinged entirely on relatability and warmth. But what they had on film painted a very different portrait. That was when whispers of a deeper investigation began. Ted Sarandos, who had once personally championed the project, asked for an internal review of the production logs and behind-the-scenes footage. Meetings were held in hushed tones. Contracts were reviewed again. Legal teams began compiling notes, not for litigation, but for options. Could they pivot? Could they salvage it? Or worse, did they need to distance themselves from their royal golden goose? The clock was ticking, and Meghan, reportedly unaware of the full extent of executive scrutiny, was pressing forward with a second-season proposal. Her team submitted plans for a holiday special, a celebrity crossover episode, and a branded product line. But behind the scenes, faith in the project was evaporating. The question wasn't whether the show would be completed. It would. But would it ever air? And if it did, would it look anything like the vision Netflix had once bought into? The answer would arrive sooner than anyone expected, and it would come in the form of a single clip. A leaked video. One that captured Meghan, mid-shoot, directing a staffer to move like you're useful, not like you're lost. The clip was short, but it was devastating. Because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't staged. It was casual, cold, and unfiltered. That clip, once viewed by Netflix's top executives, became the tipping point. And from that moment on, with love, Meghan was no longer a cooking show. It was evidence. The entertainment industry is a delicate machine. What happens behind closed doors usually stays there, until someone decides it shouldn't. And with Meghan Markle's cooking show spiraling into what many within Netflix began to quietly call a containment emergency, it was only a matter of time before cracks in the production wall became gaping holes, leaking discontent into the wider world. The first warning shot came in the form of a blind item. Posted anonymously on a celebrity gossip site, it described an American royal behaving erratically on the set of her new Netflix show. The post, vague enough to avoid legal scrutiny but pointed enough to stir speculation, claimed the woman in question treated the crew like servants, demanded absolute silence when she entered the room, and insisted on approving every frame in post-production. Within hours, Twitter was ablaze. Reddit threads dissected the clues. TikTok creators began pointing fingers. And though no names were mentioned, the timing, the language, and the context made it clear this was about Meghan Markle. The Duchess of Sussex, now rebranded as a lifestyle tastemaker, was becoming the central figure in an off-screen drama more intriguing than anything filmed for her show. What followed wasn't a tidal wave, but a steady drip. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into leaks. Former crew members, speaking under strict anonymity, began reaching out to entertainment bloggers and behind-the-scenes Hollywood commentators. They weren't out to destroy Meghan, but they were done pretending. As one former stylist put it, she doesn't want a team. She wants minions. Anonymous emails began arriving in the inboxes of entertainment journalists known for scoops. One read, "She acts like she's still at the palace, except now, she has no one to answer to." Another detailed a specific incident in which Meghan allegedly had a minor breakdown over the wrong brand of honey being used in a prop jar. The jar, intended only for background set dressing, was thrown into the trash, and the crew was ordered to delay shooting until a more authentic jar could be sourced. Soon, these stories began to surface in larger publications, framed carefully to avoid libel, but clear in implication. One entertainment outlet described an unnamed celebrity's cooking show as a masterclass in micromanagement and misery. Another, more blunt, ran a headline that simply read, "The Duchess of Demands." Meghan's defenders were quick to counter. Her spokesperson issued a brief statement, calling the rumors fabricated, sexist, and rooted in outdated tropes. But the denial did little to slow the momentum. In fact, it seemed to invite more scrutiny. Wasn't this the same Meghan who had been accused of bullying palace staff? Wasn't this the same narrative that had emerged during her brief time as a working royal? The timing couldn't have been worse. Just as these stories began circulating, Netflix quietly postponed the official release date of With Love, Meghan. The delay, originally cited as a strategic content rollout decision, soon raised eyebrows. Internally, Netflix was struggling to determine whether the show could be salvaged, or whether airing it at all would unleash a firestorm too large to contain. In response, Meghan's team went into overdrive. PR advisors began scheduling feel-good interviews and panel appearances. Meghan was photographed handing out meals at a charity kitchen, her apron neatly pressed, her smile as polished as ever. She posted heartfelt tributes on social media, highlighting her dedication to uplifting communities through food. The message was clear: this is the real Meghan. Don't believe the noise. But the noise was growing louder. One particular leak, more detailed and damning than the rest, came from a senior producer who had walked off the project midway through filming. In an off-the-record conversation with a major industry magazine, the producer described a toxic culture driven not by budget pressure or studio mismanagement, but by a singular obsession with control. According to the source, Meghan's feedback would sometimes arrive in the middle of the night via lengthy, bullet-pointed emails demanding re-edits, audio adjustments, or the removal of lines spoken by guests who diverted the spotlight. One editor, burned out from the constant changes, reportedly had a breakdown and took medical leave. Another quit altogether. She wasn't collaborating, the producer said. She was commanding. There's a difference. Another former crew member detailed a now infamous moment when Meghan allegedly forced a reshoot of an entire segment because a guest chef, in her words, took up too much emotional space. The guest, a woman of color, had spoken movingly about the history of a traditional family dish. But Meghan, watching playback later, felt the story overshadowed her own. The scene was scrapped. The guest never returned. News of that particular incident hit a nerve. The story, though unconfirmed, spread like wildfire, prompting backlash from activists and allies alike. Wasn't Meghan the one who stood for empowerment and inclusion? Why, then, was she silencing someone else's voice? Meghan's team once again denied everything, but the internet was already ahead of them. Clips from previous interviews resurfaced, showing Meghan speaking about being silenced, being erased, being overlooked. Now, some were questioning whether those experiences were being repeated in reverse, if she had become the very figure she once criticized. It wasn't just media outlets that began to distance themselves. Former allies, subtly, carefully, began going quiet. Prominent celebrity friends declined to promote the show. Partner brands delayed campaigns. A magazine feature intended to coincide with the launch was indefinitely postponed. And within Netflix, the chatter grew impossible to ignore. Executives, many of whom had originally pushed for the Sussex deal, began voicing doubts behind closed doors. One board member reportedly asked, "Are we in the business of streaming entertainment or managing personalities?" The problem wasn't just the production itself. It was the growing sense that Meghan was untouchable, that no one, not even Netflix, could rein her in. That perception created resentment, and resentment led to more leaks. Perhaps the most chilling revelation came from someone on the set who had worked closely with Meghan's personal team. According to this insider, Meghan had a nickname for the show's director, a man with decades of experience and accolades to his name. She called him the placeholder. When asked why, she allegedly said, "Because I'm the real director here." When that comment made its way back to Netflix headquarters, the decision to launch a full internal review was sealed. Not to punish Meghan, not yet, but to protect the company from what was starting to look like a reputational time bomb. As more of these stories surfaced, a new narrative took hold. Meghan Markle, the woman who had claimed to seek freedom from toxic environments, had created one of her own. The irony was not lost on anyone. It was no longer a question of creative differences or misunderstood passion. It was about behavior. Sustained, repeated, and defended. And now, the world was watching. Meghan had spent years building a carefully managed image. That image was beginning to fracture, not from the outside, but from within. Perfection is a word that has followed Meghan Markle throughout her public life, sometimes as praise, other times as criticism. From her early acting days to her royal transformation and her pivot to media entrepreneur, her image has always been one of control, elegance, and precision. But as Netflix producers and crew members dug deeper into the wreckage of the With Love, Meghan project, they began to ask a different question. Was it really perfection she was after, or was it something else entirely? The answer, as they soon discovered, wasn't simple. What they had witnessed on set wasn't just a woman trying to create a quality production. It was someone orchestrating every last detail with military precision, to the point where spontaneity, collaboration, and even joy were sacrificed for control. And it wasn't just about making things look good, it was about dominating the process. From the moment filming began, Meghan had insisted that every element reflect a specific emotional texture, a phrase she reportedly repeated often in pre-production meetings. This emotional texture had to be soft, elevated, aspirational. Images that reflected not just the food, but her own internal brand. But as staff soon discovered, achieving this texture was less about storytelling and more about total compliance. Each episode's script, though promoted publicly as free-flowing and unscripted, was meticulously plotted. Meghan would send back early drafts of episode outlines with line-by-line annotations. One writer recalled receiving a document that was 18 pages long, covered in red ink and notes like, "Too aggressive, doesn't feel royal." This moment should reinforce resilience and insert a subtle metaphor about empowerment here. Even the show's visual color palette wasn't left to the creative team. Meghan personally selected the shades of paint used in the kitchen, the pattern of the tablecloths, the exact grain of the wood countertops. When a lighting technician adjusted a rig to better illuminate a dish, Meghan reportedly halted the shoot and asked, "Why are we using hospital lighting on a show that's supposed to feel like home?" What started as an eye for detail quickly evolved into an obsession that alienated nearly everyone around her. No decision was too small for her input, and no suggestion from crew was too respected to stand unchallenged. She rewrote guest introductions, insisted on reshoots for facial expressions she didn't like, and at one point asked a guest chef to change their story about a childhood dish because it conflicted with the emotional tone of the episode. For the culinary team, working with Meghan meant not only executing on food styling and authenticity, but navigating a maze of contradictory instructions. In one instance, she reportedly demanded that a particular curry dish be served in a rustic, family-style bowl that speaks to togetherness, only to later have the segment cut because the dish appeared too chaotic in a wide shot. The guest chefs, many of whom had flown in from different parts of the world and carried rich cultural legacies, were treated more like background actors than experts. One respected Latin American chef recounted how she was told to make the flavors simpler because Meghan wanted the episode to feel clean, not overwhelming. Another, a celebrated African American chef, was allegedly advised to wear a softer color so as not to distract from Meghan's outfit. The irony was palpable. A show meant to highlight diversity, culture, and authenticity was slowly being drained of those very elements, all in service of maintaining a singular image, Meghans. But what made the atmosphere even more charged was the unspoken rule that no one could question her, not directly. Crew members learned quickly that criticism, even constructive, was not welcome. If you raised a concern, you were either labeled negative, not aligned with the vision, or quietly removed from the core team. One producer, a veteran of multiple successful culinary shows, described it succinctly. "You weren't working with Meghan. You were working around her." Her personal assistants, once thought to be her closest allies on set, were seen whispering nervously, always one step ahead of her mood. On days when Meghan arrived cheerful and energetic, the entire team breathed easier. But those days were rare. More often, she arrived late, on edge, with new demands that upended the carefully constructed shooting schedules. A camera operator joked once, "You could feel the energy shift as soon as her car pulled in." Netflix executives were not oblivious to this. Reports from the set painted an increasingly grim picture. Morale was low, deadlines were slipping, and budgets were ballooning. But despite all that, Meghan maintained her stance. She believed she was crafting something meaningful, something with legacy. She reportedly told her team, "This isn't just a cooking show. This is my story told through food, through people. If we don't get this exactly right, it's not worth doing." But somewhere along the way, the line between storytelling and control began to blur. The tension came to a head during a multi-day shoot with a beloved TV personality who had agreed to appear on the show as a favor. The guest, known for her down-to-earth charm and sharp wit, immediately connected with the crew. Her segment was meant to be playful, lively, a break from the heavy emotional themes of earlier episodes. Yet, the moment the cameras began to roll, Meghan stepped in. She adjusted the guest's posture. She instructed the guest to focus on connection, not comedy. And when the guest riffed a spontaneous joke that had the entire crew laughing, Meghan halted the shoot. She requested the joke be removed from the edit because, according to her, it detracted from the purpose of the moment. The guest didn't return the next day. In the days following that shoot, murmurs of Meghan's behavior began spreading beyond the production lot. People in Hollywood talk, and soon agents, producers, and studio reps were all comparing notes. She's impossible to direct. She treats people like they're auditioning to be in her life. It's not about collaboration, it's about obedience. The term diva began popping up in conversations again, echoing older tabloid narratives, but now bolstered by first-hand accounts. Meghan's critics saw it as validation. Her supporters saw it as a coordinated smear. But to those on set, the reality was more complicated. It wasn't just diva behavior, it was power obsession. And the pursuit of control had turned a creative space into a psychological war zone. By the time the raw footage was collected and sent for editing, the cracks in the production were impossible to ignore. Editors were instructed to remove any segment where Meghan didn't appear empowered. Voiceover sessions were rescheduled repeatedly so she could tweak her tone. Transitions had to be reworked because her wardrobe in one segment clashed with the story arc of the next. What should have been a simple, heartwarming cooking series became a Frankenstein of spliced clips, tailored soundbites, and overproduced sincerity. And yet, despite everything, Meghan believed in the project. To her, the effort was necessary. The perfectionism wasn't ego, it was protection, a way to reclaim the narrative after years of press torment and royal exclusion. But to everyone else, it felt suffocating. Perfection, they realized, was never the goal. Power was. The power to dictate how she was seen. The power to shape every word, every smile, every silence. And the power to erase anything, or anyone, that didn't fit her version of truth. But power, unlike perfection, is rarely invisible. And when it's abused, it leaves a trail. That trail, already smoldering, was about to ignite into a wildfire when someone decided to do the unthinkable, send an unedited clip straight to Netflix's top floor. Every production has its breaking point, the moment when tension, pressure, and suppressed frustration explode into chaos. On the set of With Love, Meghan, that moment arrived quietly at first, like a distant rumble. No one expected it to come that day. The morning was calm, the lighting perfect, and the cast and crew were ready to shoot one of the season's most anticipated segments, a celebratory feast featuring a blend of multicultural dishes inspired by Meghan's heritage and influences. Spirits were high, but within hours, that optimism would turn into stunned silence. And by the end of the day, half the crew would threaten to walk. It started with a single misstep, a missing centerpiece. The table, meticulously set for a family-style meal, had been arranged by the set designer the night before. Every plate, bowl, and candle had been positioned with surgical care. But when Meghan walked onto the set that morning, her eyes immediately scanned the room and settled on the centerpiece. A bowl of bright lemons surrounded by sprigs of lavender and rosemary. She stopped walking. The room fell silent. "Who changed the centerpiece?" she asked, her voice flat. No one answered. The producer stepped forward and explained that the floral team had added the lemons because the original centerpiece hadn't held up overnight. It was meant to add freshness, evoke Mediterranean themes, and still aligned with the set's aesthetic. It was, objectively, beautiful. Meghan didn't see it that way. She turned to the assistant art director and said, "It looks cheap. This entire table feels uninspired. Take it down." That was the spark. The art team, already exhausted from long hours and last-minute changes throughout the week, stood frozen. One of them gently reminded Meghan that redoing the table would delay shooting by at least an hour, possibly more. They were on a tight schedule. They had celebrity guests arriving, dishes to prepare, lighting cues to meet. Meghan didn't budge. "I'm not asking. I'm telling." The assistant director reluctantly nodded to the team, who began dismantling the table under Meghan's watchful eye. The mood on set shifted immediately. What had been a scene of festive anticipation now felt like a funeral march. Dishes were pulled, napkins refolded, the lemons vanished. But that wasn't the end. With the table being redone, Meghan used the downtime to walk through the script again. She paused over a segment where a guest chef was scheduled to describe how her grandmother's spice mix had shaped her cooking style. Meghan frowned. "This doesn't work," she said. "It's too personal." It'll distract the audience. The producer reminded her that the entire episode was about personal connections to food. That was the whole premise. Meghan shook her head. It's not resonant with the larger message. It's her story, not ours. She crossed it out and moved on. The scriptwriter, visibly upset, stepped out of the room. What followed was a series of increasingly erratic decisions. Meghan asked for the wardrobe team to replace her outfit, citing lack of energy. She called for the food stylist to change the glaze on a dish, claiming it looked unappetizing on camera. She requested the culinary team recook 3 items to better balance the tones on the plate. These weren't minor adjustments. They were total overhauls, each one throwing the schedule further off course. The crew, many of whom had been working 14-hour days for weeks, began to whisper among themselves. The kitchen grew tense. Eyes rolled quietly, but no one said anything out loud yet. Then came the turning point. As cameras began to roll on a reset version of the opening segment, a young production assistant missed a cue to move a light diffuser slightly to the left. The error created a barely visible glare on Meghan's left side, something most would never notice. Meghan did. She stopped mid-sentence, turned to the director, and snapped. Why is no one watching the lighting? This is episode 6. We shouldn't still be making amateur mistakes. The director tried to defuse the situation, explaining it was a minor issue and easily fixed in post. Meghan cut him off. Why are we relying on post? That's lazy. Fix it now. The room went dead silent. The young assistant, red-faced and embarrassed, tried to apologize, but Meghan had already moved on, waving her hand dismissively and saying, "Just go." It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. That moment, caught on multiple behind-the-scenes cameras, captured more than a reprimand. It captured the hierarchy, the disdain, and the complete absence of empathy. The assistant walked off set. 5 minutes later, a second crew member followed. The dominoes began to fall. The head of sound pulled the director aside and quietly informed him that the boom operator was done for the day. Too tired. Too frustrated. The culinary team, still scrambling to reheat dishes that had cooled during the delays, began muttering about quitting. The script supervisor, who had been silently enduring weeks of last-minute edits and back-to-back night shifts, finally closed her laptop and left. One crew member, who had remained silent through it all, finally spoke up, not to Meghan, but to the producer. She doesn't want a team. She wants a mirror. Word of the meltdown spread quickly. By the end of the day, the set was barely functioning. Several critical staffers had either walked off or refused to return for the next day's shoot. The production schedule was now in shambles. Guests who had been invited for upcoming segments were being quietly rescheduled or canceled. Still, Meghan insisted on continuing. The cameras rolled once more, this time on a scene that Meghan called a healing moment. It was meant to be a solo reflection segment, where she sat at the head of the table and shared a story about resilience, growth, and how food brought her peace. The irony was bitter. Outside the frame, chaos reigned. But inside, Meghan looked composed, elegant, and reflective. She delivered her monologue in one take. The crew, those who remained, said nothing. And then she left. Later that evening, as executives in Los Angeles reviewed the day's production notes, the incident was labeled as unsustainable. A private memo was circulated among senior Netflix leadership, detailing the walkouts, the resignations, and the growing toxicity on set. One executive reportedly wrote, "This is no longer a content issue. It's a workplace issue." But it wasn't just Netflix taking notice. A crew member, infuriated by what they had witnessed, took matters into their own hands. Using a secured connection, they sent a clip from the meltdown to an internal whistleblower hotline set up by Netflix for ethical concerns. It wasn't the lighting error or the missed cue that mattered. It was Meghan's reaction. The clip, short and raw, showed Meghan snapping, then sighing with disdain, and finally whispering something to a colleague. "I can't work with people who don't get it." The colleague nodded. The clip, once reviewed, became evidence. And that's when Netflix realized this wasn't just a show gone sideways. It was a reputational crisis. The very project meant to reintroduce Meghan Markle as a thoughtful, grounded creator had revealed something else entirely. Not to the audience, yet, but to the people who mattered most behind the scenes. The illusion had cracked, and what lay beneath wasn't what anyone expected. By the time word of the meltdown reached Netflix's C-suite, the story had already metastasized from an isolated incident to a potential public relations catastrophe. It wasn't just about one bad day or a difficult shoot. It was now about a pattern of behavior, a string of complaints, and growing internal dissent that threatened to stain not just a show, but Netflix's entire partnership with the Sussexes. Ted Sarandos, co-CEO of Netflix and a man known for his calculated calm under pressure, had been briefed regularly about the Meghan Markle cooking show ever since the first red flags emerged. Initially, he'd maintained cautious optimism, believing that creative tensions were standard for projects with big personalities and global expectations. But the latest report, detailing the walkouts, the footage leak, and the growing exodus of staff, left him unsettled. Not because high-maintenance talent was unusual, but because the noise surrounding Meghan wasn't going away. In fact, it was growing louder. So, Sarandos did what he rarely does. He stepped in personally. The first thing he did was order an internal audit. Not a formal investigation, not yet, but a quiet, methodical gathering of facts. He wanted everything: daily production reports, call sheets, budget deviations, exit interviews from staff who'd walked, and, most importantly, raw, unedited footage from every shoot day that had taken place so far. He didn't want summaries. He wanted to see it for himself. Over the course of several days, Sarandos and a small, trusted team sat in a private screening room within Netflix headquarters in Los Gatos. The footage, clocking in at over 120 hours, was raw and unfiltered. What they saw changed everything. Scene after scene showed Meghan obsessing over minor details, snapping at staff, demanding retakes for minuscule imperfections. In one instance, she halted a shoot because a guest wore a necklace she deemed too distracting. In another, she insisted on scrapping an entire segment because the visual balance of a dish didn't communicate gratitude. It wasn't just the commands. It was the tone. Even in quiet moments, Meghan's demeanor suggested superiority. The way she waved off assistants, the clipped tone she used with crew, the icy glares when things didn't go her way, all captured in high definition, beyond the scope of any editing suite. The footage painted a portrait that clashed violently with the brand Netflix had hoped to build around her: warm, engaging, inclusive. What they saw instead was calculated, sharp, and deeply controlling. But Sarandos wasn't just watching for attitude. He was watching for liability. And the more he watched, the more concerned he became, not just about Meghan's behavior, but about how many people had silently endured it without speaking up until it boiled over. He called for more documents. The HR department compiled every formal and informal complaint related to the show. Anonymous statements from staff described a culture of fear. One crew member wrote, "We weren't collaborating. We were surviving." Another called the atmosphere emotionally unsafe. A chef who had been featured in 2 episodes submitted a lengthy exit letter detailing how her story was edited to serve Meghan's narrative, not truth. Perhaps the most alarming entry was a log from a therapist contracted by Netflix to support production crews on long-term shoots. The therapist's notes included references to burnout, anxiety, and what they described as a leadership figure whose behavior consistently bordered on emotional manipulation. For Sarandos, this was no longer about salvaging a show. It was about salvaging the company's integrity. Still, he knew that any move made against Meghan Markle would come with consequences. This was not just a celebrity. This was a woman who had publicly spoken about being silenced, bullied, and isolated by institutions. If Netflix moved too hard or too fast, it risked becoming the villain in her next narrative. The optics would be brutal. Accusations of sexism, racism, and betrayal could be weaponized overnight. So Sarandos chose a different path: containment and leverage. He ordered a second round of reviews, this time from Netflix's legal and PR teams. They were to determine how insulated the company was from liability should Meghan choose to go public with any grievance. They combed through contracts, email threads, and production agreements. They assessed how much editorial control Meghan actually had, and what claims she could potentially make if the project was delayed, canceled, or restructured. What they discovered gave Netflix more control than previously thought. Meghan's team had fought hard for creative oversight, but ultimate distribution rights, final edit authority, and project continuation decisions remained with Netflix. It was a win Sarandos hadn't realized he'd need, but now it was his greatest shield. If necessary, they could shut the whole thing down, and do so legally. But Ted wasn't interested in revenge or retribution. He wanted resolution. Quietly. His next step was to send a trusted executive, a veteran producer with diplomatic skills, to the set under the guise of a creative consultant. The executive's job was to observe and report, not to intervene. Within 2 days, the report came back. This is not sustainable. Leadership is missing. The team is broken. And Meghan is isolated but unaware. Still, Sarandos gave Meghan the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps the stress had overwhelmed her. Perhaps she didn't realize the harm she was causing. Perhaps there was still a chance to save the relationship. He authorized a meeting, private, discreet, and off the record. Meghan was flown to Los Angeles to meet with Sarandos and 2 other senior executives at an undisclosed location in Beverly Hills. According to insiders, the meeting was tense but polite. Sarandos began by expressing admiration for Meghan's vision, her ambition, and the importance of her voice. But then he shifted. He presented her with feedback from the crew, concerns from legal, and his personal viewing of the footage. He did not attack her. He asked questions. Did she believe the working environment on set was healthy? Did she feel supported or embattled? Was she open to bringing in a showrunner with more experience? Could she see why some elements of the footage might come across as problematic? Meghan reportedly sat in silence for much of the meeting. When she did speak, she defended her choices. She described the show as a reflection of my truth, and argued that the resistance she faced was rooted in a discomfort with powerful women directing their own narrative. She did not deny being exacting, but rejected the term difficult. Sarandos nodded, listened, and ended the meeting with a single sentence. We want to support your vision, but we also need to protect our people. After the meeting, Meghan's team went silent. There were no follow-up emails, no phone calls, no rescheduling of production. Instead, her representatives began circling the wagons, reaching out to PR firms and advisors, asking questions about crisis communications and reputation management. Someone within her camp, sensing what was coming, began to prepare for the worst. Sarandos, meanwhile, prepared for the next phase. He called for the internal release of the footage that had caused the most concern, the short clip of Meghan dismissing the young production assistant after a lighting error. The clip, along with several other moments, was shown to a closed panel of Netflix executives, HR officials, and legal advisors. The panel's consensus was immediate. The footage posed a reputational risk, not just to Meghan, but to Netflix itself. And if the show were to air in its current form, there was a real chance of backlash not from tabloids, but from the general public. That was when Sarandos made his quietest, but most important decision yet. He authorized the strategic leak, not of the raw clip itself, but of its existence. The leak would go to a trusted journalist known for industry exposés, someone who could write about the behind-the-scenes tensions without releasing the actual footage, yet. The purpose wasn't to destroy Meghan. It was to build a firewall, to ensure that if and when the narrative turned against Netflix, they could say, "We didn't hide this. We acted." The leak worked. Within days, headlines emerged. Trouble on set of Meghan Markle's Netflix show. Sources describe chaos, walkouts, and power struggles. The public conversation began to shift. Sympathy was mixed with skepticism. People started to ask whether Meghan, for all her charm and poise, might also be guilty of the very toxic dynamics she had once condemned. And for Netflix, that was enough for now. The show was not canceled. Not yet. But the wheels were turning. Contracts were reviewed again. Marketing plans were frozen. And Ted Sarandos, usually a man who stays behind the curtain, was now firmly in control. He had seen the footage. He had heard the stories. And he knew the truth. The question now wasn't whether, with love, Meghan could still be aired. It was whether it ever should. There is something unrelentingly honest about raw footage. It doesn't lie, it doesn't flatter, and it doesn't edit out the truth. For most productions, it is a behind-the-scenes tool, used to cut, shape, and polish a narrative into something palatable. But for Netflix, the unfiltered material captured during the filming of With Love, Meghan became something else entirely. It wasn't just raw data for editing, it was a mirror. And what that mirror reflected forced a global streaming giant to confront a question it had never expected to ask. Had they been sold a brand or a performance? Inside Netflix's post-production archive, every single frame from every day of the show's shoot was stored in secure digital vaults, standard practice for major productions. Hours of Meghan on set, off camera, in makeup, rehearsing, interacting, or simply waiting between takes had been backed up. In most cases, only key editors, showrunners, and project managers would review the content. But in this case, a quiet directive came down from the highest level. A dedicated internal team was to comb through every second. The process was not rushed. It was meticulous. Over 3 weeks, a small group of trusted editors and compliance officers reviewed footage chronologically, starting from day one. What they uncovered wasn't a smoking gun. It was something more damaging. A pattern. From the first hour of the first shoot, Meghan Markle was in control. That in itself wasn't a red flag. Many creators are intimately involved in the direction of their projects. But as the hours wore on, a recurring dynamic emerged. Meghan wasn't collaborating. She was dictating. And when her expectations weren't met immediately, tension followed. In one clip, Meghan stops mid-scene to correct a guest's pronunciation of an ingredient, gently at first. But when the guest stumbles again, her tone sharpens. It's important to respect the authenticity, she says, her smile tight, her voice controlled. Off camera, moments later, she mutters, "That's the third time. If you can't say it right, you shouldn't be on the episode." She doesn't know her mic is still hot. In another segment, Meghan interrupts a food stylist who is plating a rustic West African dish. "No, no, no," she says, waving her hands. "It's too heavy. Can we make this lighter? More minimalist?" The stylist explains that the meal is meant to reflect traditional abundance. Meghan sighs and says, "Yes, but not everyone needs to know that." Then there was the infamous tea segment, never aired, never edited, and ultimately discarded. The concept was simple. Meghan and a guest sit for afternoon tea, sharing stories of cultural traditions. On camera, it begins smoothly. But within minutes, Meghan stops the shoot. She asks the guest to lower her voice slightly, saying it sounds too assertive. A second take is attempted. This time, Meghan asks her to smile more because the warmth isn't coming through. The guest appears visibly uncomfortable. Her posture stiffens. The energy shifts. When they pause for a lighting reset, Meghan pulls the producer aside. "She's great," she says, "but we need to shape the tone better. I don't want this to feel confrontational." The footage from after the segment was revealing. The guest left early, without completing her final interview. When asked why, she told the production coordinator, "I was invited to be myself. Then I was told to be someone else." As the review team cataloged more clips like this, it became clear the public persona Meghan cultivated, compassionate, empathetic, a champion of women's voices, was rarely present when the cameras weren't rolling. And even when they were, her demeanor carried a sense of strategic self-awareness, not sincerity. Another segment showed Meghan coaching a young intern on how to cue her before each scene. "Don't say, 'We're ready.' Say, 'It's time for your story.'" The intern smiles awkwardly. Meghan doesn't. "Words shape mood," she adds. "We control the room with language." But perhaps the most unsettling footage came from a crew camera placed to record B-roll while the main set was being reset. In it, Meghan sits at the kitchen counter reviewing her notes. A staff member approaches to deliver a schedule change. He speaks softly, apologetically. "There's been a guest cancellation." Meghan doesn't look up. "Tell someone else," she says. "I don't do last-minute problems." She then turns to her personal assistant and asks for essential oils to be brought in. "Something calming," she adds. "Today's been chaotic." Throughout all this, no one yells. No one throws things. There's no dramatic outburst or overt bullying. But the footage exposes something quieter and in some ways more chilling, a culture of absolute control, emotional distance, and subtle degradation. The staff tiptoe. They whisper. They obey. And Meghan rarely makes eye contact unless she's on camera. For the Netflix team, this was more than disappointing. It was embarrassing. They had invested millions into a personality whose public appeal hinged on authenticity, vulnerability, and a break from institutional coldness. Yet here was evidence that the very toxicity she had publicly denounced had taken root in her own creative ecosystem. At a private screening session organized for senior leadership, key clips were assembled into a compilation titled Unseen Meghan. No one outside Netflix has viewed this reel, but according to 3 separate insiders, the reactions ranged from stunned silence to visible discomfort.